Boker Tov. Today's Daf Yomi is Kesubos, Daf Zayin, Kesubos 27. Today's Daf Yomi, we're going to start on the top of Zayin Amud Aleph, where the Gemara is discussing a contradiction between our Mishnah and a Mishnah in Adios. And our Mishnah had said that if a woman was captured by idolaters, if it was through money, she's allowed to be we allow her to return to her husband. Whereas the Gemara now says 2 lines on the bottom, or 3 lines on the top on 27a, that I'm a Rabba. So Rabba's citing a statement that accords with an initial statement that Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak said in the name of Rav, and when do we say this idea that if a woman was captured and she was captured for money, she's permitted to be with her husband? That's only when the Yad Yisrael, the Jews were in control. And so, but if the idolaters were in control, then we don't believe her even about money. So in that context, on the top of 27a, the Gemara says, we learned this in a Mishnah from Adios, where the Mishnah in Adios tells us, hey, Rabbi Yossi HaKohen, Rabbi Zachariah ben Akatzav, Abbas Yisrael, that Rabbi Yossi HaKohen, Rabbi Zachariah ben Akatzav testified about a daughter of Jewish people, Shurahana Ba'ashkon, that she caused herself to be listed as a deposit. She basically auctioned herself off in Ashkelon, and as a result of this, her family didn't want to be with her anymore. They distanced themselves from her. They didn't want to marry her relatives. But then witnesses came and testified that she was not secluded, and she was not defiled. And the Chachamim said, if you believe her that she was, when she says that she was deposited, then also believe her that she was not secluded, that she was not defiled. And if you don't believe her that she wasn't deposited, then don't believe her. Then if you don't believe her when she said she wasn't defiled, then don't believe her when she said she wasn't deposited. The Gemara says, okay, so now we'll look from this Mishnah in Adios. In Ashkelon, she clearly was in captivity because of money, because it was for the purpose of raising the money to pay off her debt. The time of the Eidim Eden, what's the whole reason why witnesses believe her? It's only because. What's the reason that we believe her? Because witnesses testify about her. So well, but if witnesses don't testify about her, we don't believe her. So how can we say in our Mishnah this statement? This contradicts the idea that we had said in our Mishnah, because here it says we only believe her through witnesses, but whereas in the Mishnah it says that we believe her even without the witnesses. That's the implication of the Mishnah. So the Gemara answers, my love, so the Gemara says, when they say that we don't believe her when she was captured unless there are witnesses, doesn't mean it doesn't matter if she was deposited, or if it was just a deposit, or if it was witnesses. So the Gemara explains, no, that's not the case. Oh, Harana Shani. Now the case of Harana, there we will believe her without the witnesses. As Rashi explains, because her Hana happened from Das, that happened on her own. And since the time came and she didn't allow herself, and she wasn't redeemed, and it's like she belongs to the idolaters and following their laws. And that's the reason why we need witnesses to testify that she wasn't secluded. Some say this whole discussion as a contradictory sources, and they raise it as a question, and that's how people have the source of this discussion. So the Gemara says, and this is how the conversation went down. Tanan, we learned Mammon Muteris about that. Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak said that if it would have happened through money, she would be Mammon, she would be permitted to be with her husband. And that is what our Mishnah had said. Mammon, she's Muteris about. For a minimum, we have a contradictory source because Hayed Rabbi Yossi, because there in that source, she's only permitted if there were witnesses. So the Gemara explains the Ashkelon Daidei Mammon, but an Ashkelon in that case where we have from Adios, that was a case that happened through money, and nevertheless we say that the only reason why she's permitted to be with her husband is because there were Adim. The Adim Edin or so, because witnesses are testifying. Ain't Adim Edin or so well, but if there were witnesses were not testifying, we wouldn't trust her. Mashani, and what's the answer? I'm Shmuel Bar Yitzchak. Well, kasha, it's not difficult. Kan sheyad Yisrael to keep out of the kachavim. Kan sheyad of the kachavim to keep out husband. It depends who is in charge. If the Jews are in charge, then if it's for money, then we don't need witnesses. But if the idolaters are in charge, then we would require the money. We would require the witnesses, even if it was just for money. Says the Gemara, that if she had been captured for the purposes of nefashos, which is usually capital punishment, then she's prohibited to be with her husband. What's this a case of nefashos? So it says, Amarav Kagon Dashi Ganave, like the women of robbers. So what is this referring to? Rashi says that their husbands were captured to be hung. And so the way of the kingdom was to be mafkir. The way of the kingdom was the hafker beitam Hashem, that it was to take their houses and their wives and to make them hafker, to make them basically open season. And so therefore, that reason she's prohibited to be with her husband. The assumption is that she was going to be assaulted. The Levi, or alternatively, the other way to interpret is the assumption not that she was assaulted, but that she willingly gave of herself to save her life. The Levi says, "Kagon Ishto shel Ben Dunai." No, we're referring to the case of the wife of Ben Dunai. Who's Ben Dunai? He was a murderer. And his name was Eleazar, and so therefore, then we have to have the assumption that she would become prohibited. But the wives of robbers, those women were not made hefker. Amar Chizkiya, that's where these people were sentenced to death. That's where we say their wives become prohibited. He says, no, even though they were not sentenced to death, their wives become prohibited. Just when they went on trial. Says the Mishnah, let's say you have a city that was conquered by that went under a siege. Then kol kohenes shenim tzu b'soch absuos, and all the women who were able to be married to the kohanim, but if they're found in there, or all the women who were married to the kohanim who are found in the city become disqualified because we assume that they were assaulted. But if there are witnesses that they were not assaulted, a few eved, a few shifra, even if the witness is a slave or a maid, we're going to believe them. And they're allowed to remain with the Kohanim. A person that believes to testify about themselves. So it says the Gemara, we have a contradictory source because our Mishnah says that all the Kohanos in the city that was a siege are disqualified. But what is a contradictory source? Let's say you have a Balashas, that's a marauding group, that's a group of soldiers. That they come to the city b'shas shalom, and if they come during a time of peace, chavios pesuchos, if their barrels are open, asuros. We're going to say that the marauders, if there were open barrels, they must have the wine is going to be prohibited because it's what's called yayin nesaf, that they touched the wine and made it prohibited. But if it's sumos, but if it was closed barrels, they're mutaros, then they're going to be permitted. So this is the source from the Mishnah of Vodazar, that if you have the Balashas that comes to the city during a time of peace, the open barrels are prohibited and the closed barrels are permitted because we say that they don't have time, that they're not going to touch the barrels that are closed. But B'shas Malchama, but if it was a time of war, even the open barrels are going to be permitted. Elu ve'elu mitaras, because they don't have time to do the libation. So we see from here that during a time of a war, we're not going to assume that they have time to deviate from the battle. They have to be in the battle. So therefore, the wine is going to be permitted. So here, why in the case of a siege do we say the women are prohibited? The soldiers don't have time. So Rav Yitzchak bar Elazar Mishmei Nechizki Amar Kam B'Karkom Shel Osa Malchus. Excuse me. First answer is Amar Rav Mari Mavol Yesh Pnai L'Naseach Ein Pnai. Says to do the libation, which is for religion, for their worship. There they don't have time, but to revolt, to do bia, to satisfy their sexual urge, that they always make time for. Yitzchak bar Elazar Mishmei Nechizki says Kam B'Karkom Shel Osa Malchus Kam B'Karkom Shel Malchus. It says, well, it depends which. It depends which kingdom it is. If it's a siege that's being done by the same kingdom, then they're not going to want to destroy the people of the city, and so then the women are going to be permitted because people of that kingdom are going to protect. The soldiers of that kingdom are going to be a little bit better behaved when it comes to their own kingdom. But if it was a siege of another city, then we're going to say that the women will be assaulted. So Gemara says, even if it's their own city, there's got to be one soldier who assaulted one woman. So Amar Rabbi Yehuda Mishmol, Kishemishamros Roas. No, when they have the Mishmaros, that this was the place where the showmen were standing, and to make sure that they don't, and watching all the soldiers to make sure they don't hurt anybody or assault anybody. So that's what we're talking about. Kishemishamros Roas. So the Gemara says, well, still, I'm a porta. Of course, one of the guards is going to fall asleep for a moment. So Amar Rabbi Levi could go into Mahadar Masa, Shushilta, the Kaaba, the Gavsa, the Avsa. No, it's when they put around the city a chain and dogs and geese, and basically they put a whole bunch of stuff around the city to make sure, and sticks. And like they put up a fence and they have security to make sure that nobody gets through. Amar Rabbi Ava Bar Zavda Pugi Bar Rabbi Yehuda Nesiv Rabbanan Chad Amar Kam B'Karkom Shel Osa Malchus Kam B'Karkom Shel Malchus Chash. Rabbi Ava Bar Zavda says Rabbi Yehuda and Nesiv Rabbanan are arguing. One says it's the siege of that kingdom. One says siege of another kingdom. And for one of them it was not. Had no questions. One had all these questions that we asked. The Mashani could go into Mahado and Masa Shushil to the Kabul Gazabas. And they give the same answer, they had security around it. Amar Vidi Baravan, Amar Yitzchak Barashian, Yesham Machboa Achas. If there is one hiding place in the whole city, Matzelas al Kahunos Kohen. It saves for all the women in the town. That one hiding spot is enough to say that all the women in the town can still be with their husband as the Kohen. So by Rabbi Yirmiyah, challenges. He says, let's say it's only enough to save one person from one of those women. What do we say then? We say every single woman. She might have been that one woman, and so therefore she's saved. Or maybe we can't say that. We can't say that every woman might have been that one woman who was saved. Therefore, we don't say that. The Gemara says, how is this different from the case we had we had this in Pesachim, if you might remember, that there were Shnei Shvil, and that there were two paths that were leading to a place. Echad Tameh, one path is Tameh, Echad Tahor. One had a cemetery on it, and one didn't. And the person went down one of them, Vasa Taharos, and then he touched ritually pure items. His friend went down this second path, and he touched the Taharos. So one of them, they both touched Taharos, and one of them definitely went down the road, which has the dead body on it. So Rabbi Yehuda says, if each one comes and asks by themselves, am I Tameh? We're going to say you're Taharos. You're biblically not Tameh because it's a suffix, it's a doubt about a Tumah in a public domain, and there we are lenient. So fine. Rabbi Yehuda Omar. So that's what Rabbi Yehuda says. If you ask about this one by itself and this one by itself, it's Taurus. But Shneim Ka'achas, but if you go down both of them all at the same time, Tameos, then you're going to be disqualified. Rabbi Yossi Omar Benkach or Benkach Tamei. Rabbi Yossi says both ways you are Tamei, whether you ask by yourselves or whether So again, going back to Rabbi Yehuda, he says if they each ask on their own, they are tahor. But if they ask at the same time, then we're going to say they're tamei. Because if you ask at the same time, then for sure one of them is tamei. So you can't say that both of them are tahor there because they're both coming to ask at the same time. Whereas Rabbi Yossi says ben kach u ben kach tamei. Where Rabbi Yossi says either way, since one of them for sure walked down the path, so that ta'aros, one of them for sure became tamei, we're going to say that they're both tamei. And so Rav or Rabbi Yochanan explained, and if both people ask at the same time, we're going to say it's tamei. If they asked one after another, everybody's going to say it's tahor. Because then you could assume maybe it was the other guy. But where's our dispute? One guy asks about himself, and he also asks about his friend. One says it's like they both ask at the same time. One compares it to asking one after the other. And here, also going back to the case of the women who were captured in the city, given the sharing, since Rav Yitzchak Bar Asian is allowing all the women in the town, it's like you asked about all of them all at once. And so therefore it should be prohibited. Or it's like they both all came at the same time. According to everybody, they should be prohibited. So the Gemara says, no, that's not the same case. There, in the case of the dead body, there's for sure a dead body on one of the roads. We don't know for sure that they were defiled here. We just are concerned about it. So therefore, it's not the same. It's not the same situation. So Rav Ashi asked the question, so let's say she says, listen, I didn't hide, but I know I wasn't defiled. So she said, I know for sure I wasn't in that hiding spot, but I also wasn't defiled. Now, me, Amrina, do we say, we're on the top of 27b, do we say in this circumstance, that why did she have to lie? If she wanted to, she could have said, I hid. Or we don't say that. We don't say that. Maybe we don't say that, and therefore she's prohibited to be with her husband. And Maishna, so the says, well, how is this different? That there's a man, he rented a donkey to his friend, and he said, he said, don't go down that river, that path, because there's water down that path. He says, Zil be'orcha de Nerish, go down the path of Nerish to Lake Maya, because there's no water down that path. This guy told him, don't go down the Pakod River because there's water. It's going to ruin the donkey. What did he do? He goes down he said, go down Nerish. The guy goes down the Pakod path, sure enough, the donkey dies. But also coming to Rava, the guy says to Rava, the person who rented the donkey says, am I in? Yes, but Orcha the Nar Pakod. I was like, yes, I went down the Nar Pakod. Hold on one second. He said, yes, I went down the Nar Pakod. But there wasn't the water that killed the donkey. There was no water there. So I'm a Rava, Ma'al Shaker. Rava says, yeah, we can say that he doesn't owe the money because why would he lie? He could have said, I went down the Nerish River. Abaye says, he says, we wouldn't say Mal Shaker if there were witnesses, because we know that there's always water there. So he can't claim there was no water there. If he went down that path, no, we say for sure it died from the water. So Gemara says, it's not the same case as that. In the case of the donkey, there was for sure water. We know that there was water there. Here we don't know that she for sure was defiled. It's just our concern. Makom chashasha, in the case of where we're just concerned she was going to be defiled, we don't know for sure. Amrina, we're going to say she could have. Why would she lie? She could have said she hid. Gemara says if there's witnesses, even if it's an eved or a shifcha, nemanim. If it's witnesses, even a slave boy or a slave girl, we're going to believe them, but we don't believe in Adam Eidin Alas. The person is not believed to testify about himself. Says the Gemara, even if it is her, where it says even if it's her own witness, we believe her. Even if it's her own slave, we believe her. So the Gemara says, but we have a different source. It says, And we're talking about a circumstance where Rashi explains the scenario. Hold on one second. So we're talking about a scenario where Rashi explains what the scenario is. Rashi says that the scenario is that this person was a shchivnaran. He gave his wife a get that would be activated retroactively from that moment if he died, because he didn't want his wife to fall to chalitza for yibum. But the problem is, if they had yichud, if they had seclusion, it would be called a get yashan. The get would be disqualified. So the person says, so we learned you're not allowed to have any seclusion with her. That you're not allowed to have any seclusion with her unless there were witnesses. Or even if there was a slave, you're not allowed to have any seclusion, and as long as there are witnesses, and the witnesses are able to be a slave or a maid, except if it was her maid, because she is not going to be embarrassed about having intercourse in the presence of her maid, and so therefore her maid does not count as a witness in this situation. So if that's the case, why is her maid believed to testify that she wasn't defiled? We see her maid is basically part and parcel of herself, and the maid will not object. So Amar Papi b'shvuya etivus. First answer number one, where Papi says, well, in the case of a captive woman, it's really just a suspicion that she was assaulted, so we're going to be more lenient, and we're going to allow even the slave to testify that she wasn't assaulted. When Papa says, well, it depends whose slave. We believe his slave to testify that she wasn't assaulted, but we believe her slave is not sufficient for the purposes of yichud to prevent them from having intercourse. So the Gemara says, yes, so her slave is not going to be believed, but hakatami ain't other atzmo. But it doesn't say in our mission that a witness is not able to testify about themselves, which implies that her slave will be believed. So the Gemara explains, no, her slave is like herself. It's just an extension of her, and therefore she's going to be believed. And so therefore her slave is not believed. Third answer is from Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi says, so the first answer was they were lenient about captives. The second answer is we draw a distinction between her slave and his slave. And Rav Ashi says, both cases are her slave. A slave is going to see it and be quiet, but Hasam the Shtikasa Matirasa, in the case of the Yichud, where her silence is going to allow her wife, her mistress, to the woman who she works for, to remain with her husband, she's just going to be quiet. But in this case, so hacha the shtikasa usarta. But here, if her silence is going to force her, the woman she works for, to get divorced. Mehemna. There, we're going to believe her if she testifies. But so the Gemara says, because we're going to say, where it's the shtikasa matirasa lo mehemna, if her silence is just going to allow the woman she works for, to remain with her husband, we're not going to believe her, because it's very easy to remain silent. But in this case, where if she's silent, it's going to prohibit her, the woman she works for, then we're going to believe her, because we're going to say she's going to speak up and testify. We believe her. So Gemara says, well, why wouldn't we say in this case also that she can just come and lie if that she'd lie and say that the woman she works for is not assaulted? Gemara says, there's two steps. One is a step of being quiet and not reporting or tattletelling that her woman she worked for had seclusion with her husband. And then there's a second thing, that she actually lies and says testifies that she was not assaulted. That far we're not going to go. And the Gemara gives another example of this from the Zikin. And his brother came from chuzah, and Amalei plogli b'nechsei davi. He says, give me my father's assets. Amalei lo yadanocha. He says, I have no idea who you are. One brother shows up, and the other brother says, I have no idea who you are. So he says, also Kamei Rav Chisda. They came for Rav Chisda. Amalei shapir kamarach. He says, indeed, he's speaking good to you. He says, he doesn't know who you are, because we know that when you say you don't know who he is, that doesn't mean that he's not really a brother, because it's Vayakar Yosef Esachiv, Vehem Lo Yikiru. Yosef recognized his brothers, but they didn't know him. Because Yosef went out with a beard and came back with a beard, and so therefore they didn't recognize Yosef because he grew a beard in between. So therefore, in this case also, maybe you don't recognize your younger brother. So he says, go bring me witnesses that you're my brother. Go bring witnesses that you're the younger brother, and then you could share the estate. I'm like, so the guy says, yeah, I have witnesses in Mr. Fune, but they're afraid of him. The Gabra Alama, this guy's a member of the mafia. He's a strong guy. Gabra Alama, Amrway. So he said to the other guy, so then he said to the guy who has the witnesses, then he said to the older brother, he said, okay, bring me witnesses that he's not your brother. He says, why do I have to do that? The guy who wants my money, he has to bring witnesses that I'm not his older brother. So because the burden of proof is on him, he wants my money. He says, he says, that's what we do to you and all your other strong-armed guys. Since you guys have a reputation for intimidating witnesses, you have to bring the testimony yourselves that he's not your brother. But the Gemara asks the question, okay, well, here in this case also, let him say he'll bring witnesses and the witnesses will lie. Okay, we're worried he's going to intimidate the other guy's witnesses into being silent, but he could bring his own witnesses and they'll testify falsely on his behalf. Versus Tartilo Abdi. We're not going to say both. It's one thing to intimidate witnesses into being silent. It's another thing to get witnesses to come and testify falsely. Gemara says, Lema Katanai, let us say this question itself, is a dispute amongst the Tanaim, whether or not her own Shifcha is believed to testify on the behalf of her master. Her own Shifcha is believed to testify on her behalf. Let us say that this is Machokas about Tanaim, because we say Zu Edus, this is the testimony of a captured woman, of a woman who was captured, where everybody is believed. A man, a woman, a tinok, and a tinokes. This is the testimony. Isha, tinok, tinokes. It says who's believed, a man, a woman, a young child, a father, mother, a brother, and sister. But not her son or daughter, not her slave or a captive woman, they are not believed, or a female slave, they are not believed to testify about on her behalf. So we see from here that her shifcha is not believed. But the other source says, everybody's believed to testify on her behalf except for her and her husband. So we see from here that her slave would be believed. So isn't this a dispute amongst the Tanaim whether or not you believe your slave? Now remember, we had said at the beginning that it said why our Mishnah had said that our Mishnah didn't say specifically whether or not her slave was believed. Our Mishnah just said the following. Our Mishnah had said even Shifcha, but didn't qualify whether or not it was her slave. And so then the Gemara would start off by saying that even her slave, that her own slave was not believed. And so what's the reason? Remember we said we have a contradiction between our Mishnah, which says that even a slave is believed, and then the Mishnah in Gittin, which says that she cannot be secluded with a slave. So one answer was, so how do we and the Mishnah in Gittin says her slave is not believed. So about Yichud. So we had three answers to this question. One was the answer of Rav Papa. He says that they were lenient by slaves, by captured women, because it was a little bit far-fetched scenario. A second way to resolve the contradiction was the answer of Rav Papa. By his slave, we say he could testify. By her slave, we don't say. And then the third answer is the answer of Rav Ashi, and say that we believe we don't trust her if she's just being silent, but we believe her if she comes and actually testifies. So the Gemara says now we have these two brises that contradict each other. One says that we believe the slave, and one says we don't believe the slave. So the Gemara says, so the Gemara explains now the Rav Papi and Rav Ashi tonight. Rav Papi and Rav Ashi, again, what do Rav Papi say? That by Shvuya they believed her. By capture woman they believed her. Rav Ashi says that we're not going to believe her when she comes and testifies, but when she's silent, we'll believe her. So they have to say that indeed is a machokas Tanaim here, because one source clearly says we don't believe her, and one source says that we believe her, and so therefore, when Rav Papa says that she's not believed, it's clearly machokas Tanaim. Whereas the Rav Papa, Milema Tanai, are we forced to say according to Rav Papa, who again, whose answer was one is by her slave, one is by his slave, are we forced to say it's a machokas Tanaim? So Amachar Rav Papa, Kitanya b'mesicho fitumo. So the Rav Papa says no. When it says everybody's believed, even her slave, that's where she's speaking innocently. When her slave speaks innocently, we're going to believe her. That he was once talking, and he said, there's once a person who came before Rebbe and he was just speaking innocently. He says, I and my mother, we were captured amongst the idolaters. I went out to draw the water. So she said, so the one person said, I and my mother were captured amongst the idolaters. I went out to draw the water. Dati al imo. I was thinking about my mother. Dati al imi. I was always thinking about my mother. And then he said, and so since this woman was just speaking innocently, she wasn't testifying, she was speaking normally, Rebbe allowed her to marry a Kohen on that basis. And so therefore we see by a case of Mesicho Fituma, then that we're going to say that we believe her when she speaks in this manner. That since this child was speaking innocently, this Tino, that's what they changed the gear, said it was not an adult, it was a child who was speaking innocently, and Rebbe allowed the mother to marry because the testimony happened in Mesicho Fituma. Okay, we'll stop here. If anybody has any questions, happy to address that.